For generations we've been told the English Springer Spaniel is merely a product of modern kennel registries. But ancient DNA analysis reveals this is a simplified truth, hiding a much older story. It wasn't invented, it was hiding in plain sight for centuries. Here is the real history of the Springer, and why the paperwork got it wrong. A clue appears when the story stops looking at paintings and starts looking at breeding records. In Shropshire, England, around 1800, a more deliberate line of these dogs began to take shape, and the American Kennel Club notes a detail that changes the whole picture. Puppies from the same litter could be called cockers or springers, depending on size. That small distinction is easy to miss, but it exposes something important. The animals were not being treated as a single fixed identity yet. They were being sorted by function, by build, by the work a human expected them to do. That is where the modern idea of breed begins to look fragile. If one litter could split into two names based on body size, then the boundary was never clean. It was practical, fluid, and deeply tied to the field. A smaller dog might flush game differently from a larger one. A sturdier frame might suit a longer push through rough cover. The names came after the usefulness, not before it. And that is exactly why the early visual record matters so much. Those old images were not decorative fantasies. They were snapshots of a type already known to hunters. A compact, eager, close-working spaniel shaped by repeated demands rather than by a single decree. The body told the truth before the paperwork did. By the time Shropshire breeders were organizing dogs into clearer lines, the animal had already been carrying centuries of habits in its muscles. The endurance was there. The way it held itself near a handler was there. The instinct to rise, move, and return in rhythm with human direction was already there. What changed in 1800 was not the invention of the dog, but the human decision to separate and name what had been mixed together for generations. That distinction matters because it shifts the whole origin story. The English Springer Spaniel was not waiting passively for a modern kennel to create it. It was being recognized, partitioned, and refined from an older working population that had been visible all along. In other words, the breed's beginning was less like a sudden birth, and more like a slow uncovering of something that had existed in plain sight, first in the field, then in the litter, and only much later in the official category. So the next question becomes harder and more revealing. If the type was already present before the line was pure, and if the line itself emerged from dogs whose jobs mattered more than their labels, what was hiding deeper still in their ancestry? The answer lies beneath appearance, in a history written not by fashion, but by inheritance. In Shropshire, the separation began with something almost too practical to seem historic: size. In a single litter, the smaller puppies were called cockers, and the larger ones were set apart as springers. No grand ceremony marked it. No formal breed line was announced. A handler looked at the pups, saw which bodies could push through thick cover, and which could work closer to the birds, and the split took shape in the field before it ever entered a registry. That simple division carried enormous consequences, because it turned one working family into two paths with different futures. Around 1800, that same region produced what later would be described as the first pure line of English Springer Spaniels. The phrase sounds neat now, almost inevitable, but at the time it meant something fragile and human: repeated choices, repeated pairings, and a growing preference for one kind of worker over another. The dogs themselves still came from the same practical world. They lived beside guns, hedges, wet grass, and patient hands. Yet the moment breeders began to favor consistent size and function, the old blur started to harden into identity. What had once been a shared working population slowly acquired borders. That shift explains why the story feels so slippery when traced backward. The English Springer Spaniel was becoming recognizable not because a new animal suddenly appeared, but because people kept selecting for a specific job and body shape, until the pattern became stable enough to name. The larger dogs were expected to move game out of cover with energy and control, while their smaller relatives stayed tied to other tasks. One household could contain both, and one litter could carry the split inside it. The category grew out of use, not the other way around. The official world arrived much later. In 1902, the Kennel Club of England recognized the English Springer Spaniel as a distinct breed, separating it from the Cocker Spaniel. By then, the distinction that had started as a working convenience had become a line on paper, a boundary with institutional weight. The same dogs that once differed only by size and role were now placed into separate names, and those names began to shape how the public understood them. The paperwork did not create the temperament, the endurance, or the close partnership with people. It fixed them in a form that could be preserved, judged, and repeated. That is where the tension sharpens. If the breed's identity was only formalized in 1902, what exactly was being protected by the standard? Not a sudden invention, but a pattern already alive in older dogs. Not a clean beginning, but a history of sorting, favoring, and separating what the eye and the field had been telling breeders for decades. The English Springer Spaniel emerged from a practical world that valued what the dog could do before anyone agreed on what to call it. And once that separation was made, the breed's future could be written in a way the past never had been. By 1902, the English Springer Spaniel stepped out of the haze of working labels and into an official name, but that name carried a quiet tension. The Kennel Club of England did not invent a new animal in that year. It fixed a long-used type into a distinct breed, separating it from the Cocker Spaniel and giving judges, breeders, and owners a line to follow. A dog that had moved through estates, farms, and hunting parties as a useful springing spaniel was suddenly asked to exist on paper as something more precise, something that could be measured, compared, and preserved. That shift mattered because a name changes how memory behaves. Before recognition, a dog like the English Springer Spaniel could be valued for stamina, nose, and balance, without needing a formal identity. After recognition, those same qualities became part of a standard, and the standard began to decide which animals looked like the future of the line. In that moment, the story did not end. It narrowed. The breed gained a border, and with it came the power to travel as a defined entity rather than a regional habit. The next chapter arrived quickly enough to prove that point. In 1910, the American Kennel Club recorded the first English Springer Spaniel in the United States, carrying the breed across the Atlantic into a different kennel culture and a different audience. According to the AKC's own history page, that registration marked the breed's formal introduction to American records, where English lineage met new expectations and new forms of prestige. A dog once understood through work in Britain now entered a system that could reproduce its identity far beyond its original landscape. That American entry reveals something subtle but important. Once a breed is named, it can be exported. It can be written into books, displayed in rings, and remembered by people who never saw the old hunting grounds that shaped it. The English Springer Spaniel did not arrive in America as a mystery. It arrived as a documented continuation of older choices, carrying proof that the line had already survived one transformation and was ready for another. And yet the official name still does not capture everything. It tells us when institutions agreed to recognize the dog, but not why that dog endured so well in the first place. The answer sits in the continuity between purpose and form, a nose that could work at distance, a body built for sustained motion, a temperament that kept human partnership at the center of its usefulness. That combination made the English Springer Spaniel easy to classify on paper and difficult to reduce in life. The 1902 decision and the 1910 American record together form a deeper map. One marks the moment the English Springer Spaniel became legible to the Kennel Club of England. The other shows the breed being accepted into the archive of the American Kennel Club. Between those two dates, the dog crossed from regional familiarity to international identity. What began as a practical kind of spaniel became a named heritage, and once that happened, every later generation would inherit not just a body plan, but a history that had already been edited into permanence. That is the quiet force behind the breed's story. The name did not erase the older animal, it preserved it inside institutions that could carry it forward. If you want the next layer of the story, stay with the question of what was protected when the line was fixed, because the answer reaches far beyond a single registration page and into the deeper survival of working dogs themselves. By 1910, the English Springer Spaniel had crossed a threshold that changed everything. In the American Kennel Club record, the first English Springer Spaniel was entered in the United States, and with that single registration, a working dog tied to English fields began a second life abroad. The detail sounds administrative at first, but it carried a deeper consequence. The dog was no longer only a familiar sight in Britain. It had become recognizable enough to travel, to be named, and to be claimed on another side of the Atlantic without losing its identity. That move mattered because export is never just movement. It is selection under pressure. The dogs that arrived in America had to be understood, described, and judged in a setting where distance from the original landscape could easily blur their purpose. Yet the English Springer Spaniel did not arrive as an accident of trade or as a vague companion type. It arrived as a recognizable pattern of stamina, spring, and close partnership with hunters. The American record did not invent that character. It confirmed that the character was already stable enough to survive relocation. A more revealing turn came in 1924, when the English Springer Spaniel Field Trial Association was founded. That was not a decorative club or a quiet social circle. It was a public commitment to performance, built around field trials in the United States, where the breed could be tested in motion, under expectation, and in direct comparison with its own reputation. The formation of that association showed that the English Springer Spaniel was not merely being preserved in America. It was being reinterpreted through competition, proving that the breed's future would be shaped as much by organized testing as by pedigree papers. That shift also exposed a new kind of human bond. Field trial culture asks more than beauty and more than obedience. It asks whether a dog can read intention, hold focus, and keep working when fatigue begins to speak louder than enthusiasm. For the English Springer Spaniel, that made the United States more than a destination. It became a proving ground where instinct had to meet expectation again and again, in front of people who cared about results, but also about the trust underneath them. And once that happened, the breed's story took on another layer. The English Springer Spaniel was no longer just leaving England. It was entering a wider system of evaluation that would influence how Americans understood usefulness, style, and reliability in a sporting dog. The 1910 registration marked arrival. The 1924 founding of the English Springer Spaniel Field Trial Association marked consolidation. Between those two dates, the breed gained not only a new geography, but a new audience trained to measure its worth in work, not rumor. That is why the move outward matters so much. A dog can cross an ocean without changing what it is, but the people waiting on the other shore will still reshape its story. In the case of the English Springer Spaniel, the American chapter did not replace the English one. It hardened it, tested it, and carried it into a new public memory. If the next layer is to be seen clearly, it is worth asking what is really being protected when a breed is exported and then tested again in a new country. The animal itself, or the idea of it. The turning point came not in a show ring but in a field where every movement had to mean something. In 1924, the English Springer Spaniel Field Trial Association was founded in the United States, and that date matters because it shows how the dog's value was being defended in public, under pressure, where performance could not be faked. The point was not to admire a type from a distance. It was to preserve a worker that still had to think, search, flush, and return with confidence. That association did something subtle and powerful. It kept the English Springer Spaniel tied to a standard that was measured in action rather than decoration. A dog entered into that world was judged by pace, control, eagerness, and the quiet discipline to stay connected to the handler while moving through cover. In other words, the breed did not survive this transition by becoming less itself. It survived by having its original usefulness defended again, this time through organized competition. And that changes the meaning of its history. When a breed enters a formal trial system, people often assume it is being refined away from its roots. Here, the opposite happened. The field trials acted like a memory test. They asked whether the old instincts were still alive, whether the inherited drive to work alongside humans could remain sharp after the breed crossed an ocean and entered a new sporting culture. The answer was yes, and the answer was public. That public proof matters even more when set beside a quieter fact from modern records. A 2024 UK study, published by the Royal Veterinary College, RVC, places the breed's average lifespan at 13.5 years, defying previous estimates of 11.92 years. That number does not explain everything, but it gives the earlier picture a harder edge. The same animal that had to prove itself in 1924 was still, generations later, registering a level of longevity that suggests a resilient foundation beneath the speed and enthusiasm. It is a reminder that the English Springer Spaniel's history is not only about origin or recognition, it is also about maintenance, the quiet, repeated human decisions that kept the dog functional enough to remain useful. Seen this way, the 1924 association was not a footnote, It was a safeguard. It protected an identity that could easily have been softened into mere appearance. Instead, it kept the English Springer Spaniel connected to the demands that had shaped it for centuries. And that continuity helps explain why so many owners still recognize the same urgency in the eyes, the same readiness in the body, and the same willingness to go on working when the easier path would be to stop. If anything survives this kind of scrutiny, it is not an ornament, it is a living habit. And perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside the records. Once a dog is asked to prove itself again and again, by hunters, by judges, by breeders, and eventually by the numbers that describe its lifespan, it becomes harder to pretend that function and identity are separate things. In the English Springer Spaniel, they were never separate for long. The first surprise is not fragility, it is endurance. For a breed so often described through motion, drive, and constant readiness, the English Springer Spaniel carries a quieter truth in its biology. It can last. In a 2005 Swedish study, 29% of Springer Spaniels died before reaching 10 years old, a figure that sounds severe until it is placed beside the broader canine sample from the same study, where 35% of dogs died before that age. The difference is small, but it matters. It suggests a dog that was not collapsing sooner than its peers, even inside a population where many animals were already being lost early. Then the picture changes again. A later UK study in 2024 found an average lifespan of 13.5 years for the English Springer Spaniel. That number sits above the 12.7 years reported for purebred dogs, and even above the 12 years recorded for mixed-breed dogs in that comparison. The result is unsettling in the best way, because it refuses the usual script. The breed does not appear as a delicate heirloom held together by admiration alone. It appears as a working dog, with enough biological resilience to outlast categories that are often treated as more durable by default. That matters because lifespan is not just a statistic. It is the shape of a life with a family, a field, a routine, and a body that must keep answering demands year after year. A Springer that reaches old age is not merely surviving on paper. It is carrying the weight of weather, movement, training, and attachment through time. The long gait of those years tells a different story from the one people expect when they see a breed celebrated for energy. Speed does not always burn a life down early. Sometimes it belongs to an animal built with enough internal reserve to keep going long after the first impression would predict otherwise. Seen together, the Swedish data from 2005 and the UK findings from 2024 do more than update a record. They reopen the question of what kind of dog this has always been. The English Springer Spaniel is not only a descendant of ancient working ancestry or a product of careful human selection, it is also a breed whose body, across different national samples and different decades, has shown a stubborn capacity to endure. That endurance is not theatrical. It is measured in years, in percentages, in the gap between expectation and reality. And maybe that is where the real shock lives. The story did not end when ancient DNA showed deep roots. It did not end when historical records explained the breed's working identity. It keeps deepening in the present, where the numbers now say something almost contrary to stereotype. This is not a dog defined by inevitable shortening, but by an unexpectedly strong stay against time. If a breed can cross centuries in its ancestry and still remain competitive in longevity, then the old assumptions begin to look fragile themselves. So the question becomes more precise and more human. What else have we mistaken for weakness, simply because it was energetic, expressive, and eager to work? The English Springer Spaniel may have spent generations being read through its usefulness, but the evidence of its lifespan suggests something sturdier beneath that surface. It is not just what the breed does in a field, it is what it can carry, for how long, and without giving up the life that has been asked of it. The same energy that allowed the English Springer Spaniel to cross centuries also hides a cost that almost no one sees at first. When it runs, it seems made of drive and endless willingness. But behind this vigor, recent history adds a less comfortable layer. In 2022, data from the Orthopedic Foundation for Animals, OFA, registered hip dysplasia in 39% of Springer Spaniels, highlighting the need for selective breeding. This information, cited in public summaries of the breed, changes the tone of the conversation. It does not erase its strength. It only prevents it from being romanticized. It is precisely here that the image breaks. The English Springer Spaniel is not a promise of physical perfection, but an organism molded to deliver performance with a specific set of vulnerabilities. The same structure that helped it advance through tall grass, cold water, and irregular terrain also requires continuous attention when life stops being hunting and becomes a domestic routine. Hips, body weight, repeated impact, responsible selection. All of this enters the calculation. The dog that seemed defined only by resistance now reveals a biological engineering more delicate than the legend suggests. This detail matters because it dismantles a simplistic idea of superiority. Longevity does not mean absence of risk. A body can last well and still carry very concrete points of fragility. In the English Springer Spaniel, this combination is the true enigma, a breed with breadth above expectation, but not shielded against orthopedic problems that affect comfort, mobility, and quality of life. Strength exists, yes, but not as invulnerability. It appears as adaptation, and adaptation always demands a form of vigilance. When a small number sits next to another, the difference seems subtle, but 4.39% against 3.52% tells a whole story about body reading, preventive care, and human responsibility. Because what is at stake is not just statistics. It is the way breeders, veterinarians, and families interpret what they see in daily life. A Springer may seem tireless on the outside and at the same time need careful management so that this disposition does not turn into silent wear and tear. The beauty of the breed remains there, but now accompanied by a warning that does not fit easy myths. Perhaps that is why the English Springer Spaniel remains so fascinating. It does not confirm the fantasy of a perfect dog, nor the opposite narrative of a fragile animal. It occupies a more interesting place, a breed that combines endurance, affection, and work, while preserving in its own anatomy the reminder that every survival story has limits. And when these limits appear, they do not diminish the animal. They only make its trajectory more real, more human, and in a way, more impressive. In 1902, the English Springer Spaniel finally stepped out of the shadow of the Cocker Spaniel in the Kennel Club of England, and that single act of separation changed everything. What had lived for generations as a practical hunting type was now being read as a distinct identity. But the real meaning of that moment only becomes clear when it is placed beside what came next. In 1910, the American Kennel Club recorded the first English Springer Spaniel, carrying the breed into a new country, a new audience, and a new kind of public life. Then, in 1924, the English Springer Spaniel Field Trial Association was founded, giving the breed a stage where working ability was not merely remembered, but measured, compared, and defended under pressure. That sequence matters because it shows how a breed can be recognized in stages without ever being invented in a single instant. The English Springer Spaniel had already been shaped by centuries of use, but these dates gave its history a paper trail, a formal voice, and a broader human reach. The AKC history page tells that story plainly. A breed name in 1902, a first registration in 1910, an organized trial culture in 1924. Each step pulled the same animal into a different light, first as a field helper, then as a registered presence, then as a competitor whose instincts had to remain sharp enough to satisfy people who cared deeply about function. And that is where the older truth becomes impossible to ignore. The name arrived late, but the behavior did not. The reach, the drive, the close cooperation with hunters, the willingness to move through cover and return again, all of it belonged to a much longer inheritance. The modern Springer did not emerge from a clean beginning. It emerged from continuity. Human hands selected for usefulness, then for consistency, then for identity. Science later looked back and confirmed what the history already hinted at. This was never just a recently assembled breed, but a living record of older canine movement across time. Seen this way, the English Springer Spaniel becomes more than a celebrated sporting companion. It becomes a reminder that many identities are built twice, once by the work that shapes the body, and again by the names that humans later place on that work. The first part happened in fields and hunting grounds, where survival and performance mattered. The second happened in kennel records, trial clubs, and registries, where memory was made official. Between those two worlds, the breed kept its energy, its loyalty, and its usefulness intact. That is the lasting revelation. The English Springer Spaniel was never born at the moment it was named. It had been arriving for a very long time, carried by selection, human need, and inherited skill. Recognition did not create its essence, it revealed it, and when a breed's deepest qualities survive long enough to be documented, compared, and celebrated, history stops looking like a label and starts looking like a lineage. So the final image is not a registry entry or a trophy from a trial field. It is a dog that crossed from old work into modern identity without losing the shape of either one. The English Springer Spaniel still carries the memory of the cover, the whistle, the handler's signal, and the discipline of repetition. Maybe that is why it feels so enduring. It is not a story of sudden origin, but of recognition catching up with something ancient, faithful, and still fully alive.